Hello, I'm Peter Dixon and I'm the reader in the parish of Croxton with Hollington in the Diocese of Lichfield. And this is the third of my 4 talks about Francis of Assisi. In the first 2 talks I gave you an outline of the life of Francis and of the key moments in his early life. I want to try to summarise in this talk what was distinctive about his ministry and why it had such a huge impact on the church at the time and why it continues to profoundly influence it today. Right from the start, Francis lived sine proprio, which is posh Latin for without property. In other words, he refused to own anything. There's a world of difference between having and using and owning. You use the air that you breathe, the water you drink, but you don't own it. I have a mobile phone from my employer, which I'm allowed to use for business and personal use, but I don't own it. You don't have to own what you use. The roots of Francis' objection to ownership can be traced back to his money-grubbing, socially mobile merchant family. Francis personally knew the lure of money making when, as a young man, he willingly threw himself into the family business. He saw it in the trade war with Perugia, which had cost him a year in a dungeon and brought him to the edge of death through sickness. He saw it in the pomp, power, fabulous wealth and worldliness of the church, which had completely blunted its message. He saw how the ordinary people reacted against it and how the churches were empty. Francis believed that all forms of wealth, power and money were both corrupt and corrupting. Anyway, in what sense can you really own anything? When Solomon dedicated the temple, which had been built by generous donations from the people, in 1 Chronicles 24 he says, "All things come from you, O Lord, and of your own do we give you." We say that every week in church, don't we? Everything belongs to God. Ownership is a human construct. It's something that we've invented to give ourselves exclusive rights of possession. Mine, not yours. It's temporary at best. There are no pockets in shrouds. Ownership is actually an illusion backed up by force. The church and the monasteries were fabulously wealthy at the time. They were as hard as any rackman in getting their dues and were forever in the law courts defending their property rights. They could not see that this was totally incompatible with the expectation that the church and the monks, as Christ's representatives on earth, were there to serve society and to look after the sick and the poor. It was like dealing with Jekyll and Hyde. They would give generously on the one hand through schooling and hospitals, but then they'd snatch it back without the other, without pity or compassion. And the common people came to despise them for it. The church would respond that they had acted only as stewards of God's wealth. The common people wondered why they weren't more generous in sharing the burden. Francis insisted that it must be possible to live without ownership and possessions. Jesus taught us to pray, "Give us today our daily bread." We should look to God for our daily bread rather than scheming about how to make and hoard money, thus cutting God out of the picture. You cannot serve both God and mammon. He spent the rest of his life proving the point. After handing back his clothes to his father, he walked away in some old jumble that the bishop found for him, and he owned nothing from that point on, not even the clothes on his back. He insisted the brothers do the same. On entering the order, they had to sell everything and give it away to the poor. This echoes the early church in the Acts of the Apostles. They were given underwear and habit, but no sandals. They went barefoot. They owned no buildings or furniture. They never had any money. Francis wouldn't allow them to even touch money, so much did he fear its corrupting influence. They could work in the fields for a meal, or they could beg in the streets for food. But if they received nothing, well, they praised God and treated it as a day of fasting. Often they were just given leftover scraps from the meal table, such as you would give to the dog. But they treated it as a banquet with grateful hearts and minds. They learnt to choose the bitter instead of the sweet. They were living the life of the early church described in Acts chapter 2. They would sell their possessions and goods, distribute the proceeds to all as any had need, and day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Everyone watched the fledgling order to see if they would starve and give up, but they did not. Instead, they discovered joy in their hardships. It's a scary thing to let go of the security you feel in your possessions. But when they did so, the friars discovered Christ hiding in the very thing they were afraid of, and what was bitter became sweet. But surely, you say, we have to earn a living to put a roof over our heads and food on the table for our families, and shouldn't we put money aside for our old age? Well, yeah, that's absolutely correct. And Francis was not saying that everyone should sell their possessions, give to the poor, and enter a life of celibate devotion to God like he and his brothers. As he himself said, someone has to keep the human race going. No, far from it. But Francis' life without property challenged the underlying assumptions people held about where our true security lies. He exhorted everyone to re-examine their attitude towards the things that they owned, and to live as if they owned nothing. Francis wasn't trying to recruit friars. He was challenging people to give up the false security of possessions and to put their trust in God instead. Once the common people understood what he was about, they loved it and they loved him, and they flocked to hear him preach. The second hallmark of Francis' life was the call to follow the example in Matthew's Gospel chapter 10, which I read earlier, where Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2, barefoot and without money or change of clothes, telling them to preach the good news in towns and villages. Francis followed that example very literally, and he and the brothers went barefoot all the time, and preaching missions became a major part of their way of life. The other part of their mission was work among lepers, partly because of the lesson Francis learnt from meeting the leper on the road, but also because of Jesus' instructions in that passage in Matthew 10 to cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. The friars were wandering preachers. As a preacher, Francis was blessed with a dazzling personality, which he used to good effect. He was a good speaker and an entertaining one. He would accompany his preaching with the latest French pop songs, which he would adapt with a Christian message. He would caper about and play air guitar, or should that be air lute. He told jokes and he made everyone laugh. The people loved him, and they quickly grew to love his message, and if they did not actually leave their lives and follow him, they certainly drew inspiration from his life, which influenced their own. As a result, the church authorities grew to love him too, as the people began to flock to Mass once more. At one point, the growth in the order looked like it might get out of hand. He preached at a nobleman's wedding once, and the bride and groom immediately wanted to sell their goods and follow Francis. He wisely refused them, pointing out that they had duties and responsibilities in the world as owners of vast amounts of land. Many depended on them for their daily bread. Instead, he wrote a rule of life for them which they could follow whilst living the ordinary life they were born to. This was the beginning of the third order, which is for men and women, married and single, lay and ordained, who, while following the ordinary professions of life, feel called to do so under definite discipline and vows, after the example of St. Francis. In the Church of England today, we have the Society of St. Francis, which has its three orders. The first are friars, both men and women, and the second are an enclosed order of nuns following the Poor Clares, and finally there's the third order, of which I'm a member. In living my ordinary life with my family and my job, but trying to do so inspired by the example of St. Francis and under definite vows and discipline. In the fourth talk, and the final talk, I'll be looking at the prayer life of Francis and his understanding of creation, which has led him to be associated with animals and ecology. So thank you for listening, and hopefully I'll see you again tomorrow for the fourth and last in this series. Goodbye.